Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi. Good to see you again. Good morning.
Welcome back, Adefemi.
Good morning, Dr. Reuven. It's great to see you. Thank you, Ayo. Good morning, Ayo. Good morning, Bimbai.
Morning, Adefemi.
So great to hear your voices. You brightened my morning up already. Thank you, thank you. Let me tell you what is happening around the world this morning. Let's begin in California, where wildfires have been responsible for at least 24 people's deaths at this moment. Now, strong winds also continue to threaten this wildfire situation that we've been seeing across Southern California that has burned entire communities to the ground. Now, in response, California State Governor Gavin Newsom has signed executive orders which will essentially see the temporary suspension of landmark environmental laws in order to accelerate the process of rebuilding. Let's take a listen to what Gavin Newsom had to say.
That's exactly. Got to be thinking 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years ahead. At the same time, we're focusing on the immediacy, which is life, safety, and property. And so that's exactly what we're doing with disaster assistance, making sure people are getting their applications, addressing the issue of fraud. And that's an issue we've got to address, price gouging. So executive orders on price gouging, recovery. We want to get inspections, units like this. We want to get our inspection teams out here. They're already starting to get out here. We've come up with some timelines so we can get within the next few weeks all that done so people can get their insurance claims. We can then start the big contracts to remove the debris. We want to fast track by eliminating any CEQA requirements. I got Coastal Act changes that we're making. I want to make sure when someone rebuilds that they have their old property tax assessments and that they're not increased. So all of that's been done in the executive order we just announced.
So as you can hear, Gavin Newsom is very, very much focused on the accelerated rate of rebuilding communities across California. Now, just to give you a bit more background on the suspended environmental laws, the first one is the California Environmental Quality Act, and that was signed into law by a gentleman, you might have heard of him. His name is Ronald Reagan, back in 1970 when he was governor of California. And essentially that law requires state and local agencies to disclose the environmental impacts of proposed projects. Now, that other environmental law, the California Coastal Act, that was signed into law, approved in 1972. And essentially what that does is protect coastal lands in California from redevelopment and making sure that if new lands or new properties are built, that the communities, that the environmental lands there are essentially protected. That being said, you can see that Gavin Newsom has taken this process of rebuilding California as quickly as possible, making sure that people are protected from price gouging on any types of examples of fraud. He has still been a victim, if you can say that, to a lot of criticism, especially coming from President-elect Donald Trump and Elon Musk, both of whom have described Californian politicians as being incompetent. Now, another California politician who has been in the firing line of criticism is the LA Mayor Karen Bass, and she has been facing a lot of criticism when it comes to her leadership since assuming office back in 2021, I believe. She talked about how it is, how criticism about her has been the reduction of budgets, specifically focused on attacking these types of natural disasters. Now, she also stood up for a press conference on Sunday, and she was asked about this criticism coming from the incoming Trump administration, and was asked about whether or not she is fearful or aware of any type of animosity. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
Actually, I'm not worried about that. I mean, I joined in the invitation to the incoming president to come to Los Angeles. I joined with the supervisor and the governor, spoke directly with the incoming administration yesterday. It was a fine call, so I'm not concerned about that. There are also, as I mentioned before, a number of my former colleagues who are up for confirmation. I feel like I will have good relations there.
Is the incoming president expected to come here?
I believe so. I mean, it was a positive response.
Well, she talks about a positive response coming from there, but definitely he, as we've already discussed, has been quite critical of the leadership in California. And looking at specific criticism coming to Karen Bass, she was criticized for traveling to John Mahama's inauguration last week in Ghana. Now, this is because at that point, even though the severity of the wildfires hadn't yet materialized, there were weather warnings, and people say that she should have stayed and focused on her community rather than traveling to Africa, traveling to Ghana for this inauguration ceremony. It also reignites some lines that we are seeing out of the New York Times this morning, which talked about how Karen Bass said that she wouldn't actually travel abroad before she assumed office. So again, a lot of criticism coming towards Californian politicians in their handling of this matter. Let's move on now to another story that links the United States, but this time with Nigeria. And essentially what we are seeing now is, if you can call her, the disgraced former oil minister Diezani Alison Madueke. Now, monies associated with the allegations against her are now in the process of being returned back to Nigeria. It's a story that came out a few days ago, essentially. And we do know that Nigeria and the United States have signed an agreement essentially to repatriate nearly $53 million back to Nigeria. Now, this is money, as I said, that is connected to Alison Madueke and her associates. Now, if this does materialize, it will be the first repatriation of monies back to Nigeria from the United States in this matter. And it is believed that this money is going to be used to fund public services. But when we are talking about the allegations, United States and the United Kingdom, we do know that Alison Madueke is facing trial in the United Kingdom as it stands now. But the United States authorities allege that she is exactly what she has been facing, which is a corrupt politician, somebody who enriched and lined her own pockets and those of her associates through the power and access she had at the helm of Nigeria's oil ministries, but also as the former leader of OPEC. And essentially what they are saying is that amongst the money that she extorted, essentially, that took for her own personal use was some 65 million or monies to that effect for the purchase of a 65-meter, super yacht. So again, it just highlights the extravagant lifestyle associated with this woman, and perhaps one of the reasons why she is facing the legal ramifications in different countries as she is now. Let's move on finally now to Chad, and we see that the ruling party in Chad has had a very successful parliamentary election. They now do have a whole lot more seats in the Chadian parliament than they had before. Now, some people say that this is not really the most fair conduction of elections, especially since 10 opposition parties decided to not participate in this election because they did not feel as though the Chadian president, the Chadian parliament at this point was one that was conducive to a free and fair election. But again, we are seeing another example of Chad moving towards a fuller representation of a democracy. But as it stands now, there are still a lot of criticism about how fair this election was, especially since huge amount of opposition parties, 10, including the main opposition party, decided to abstain from the vote. Those are your stories. Love to hear your thoughts before we move on to the newspapers.
Thank you so much, Adefemi. I'll stick with the Palisade fires. I mean, ravaging and just looking worse and worse by the day, and now becoming heavily politicized. I think what caught my attention over the weekend, two major things. The fact that, of course, Gavin Newsom cut the budget for fire prevention by about $100 million over just a couple of years ago. So this begs the question, this is a recurring event. So why would you cut the budget? So that is being heavily politicized because, those in opposition are saying that this was the wrong thing to do. And I must imagine that California residents are also feeling the same way. Now, down to the mayoral level, where as much as Karen Bass is facing a lot of backlash at the moment, there's a lot of attention also shifting to Rick Caruso, who is the gentleman who lost the election to Karen Bass, but a very tiny margin.
Yes.
But he's a developer, of course, you know the story. He's a developer who built a massive mall, Palisades Village Mall, in LA, and everything around it has burnt, but it hasn't experienced that much damage.
Yes.
So people are saying maybe we voted for the wrong person because this Rick Caruso seems to have known about fire prevention and some of the regulations and strategies we need to employ when building to prevent the extent of fire damage that has been seen. And last week I'd also made a mention of the fact that these annual fires are also very traditional in Cape Town. without fail, around February, March, you always get fires on Table Mountain and on Lion's Head. So I went to do a little bit of reading because I wanted to understand what is it that they do in Cape Town that stops it from getting to this extent that it got to in LA. And ultimately, it's biodiversity. They've planted what they call a fynbos ecosystem, which is certain plants that don't catch fire as easily, and that helps to quench the fire a lot faster. So I thought that was just quite interesting how we in Africa are more prepared for this kind of calamity than the United States.
Yeah, I think just on that one, I think it's mind-boggling to see just how badly prevention of the fires or the spread or the extent of the damage of the fire has been in Los Angeles. And of course, Gavin Newsom has come under a lot of fire, and Trump is not holding back at all. In fact, Newsom has said that Trump should avoid disinformation as it only exacerbates the issue and isn't helpful at all. I think it's going to bring his leadership under a lot of questions, even though he's now taking, being quite proactive in taking some actions like you highlighted, suspending the environmental laws. But it might be a little too late and might cost him, his political future in that particular era. But let me come home to Nigeria, which is news affecting Nigeria, but of international import. And that is the repatriated funds from former Minister of Petroleum, the Diezani Alison Madueke, who was also former Minister of Transport and former Minister of Steel Development, Mines and Steel Development in Nigeria. Quite interesting news. I think the focus for a lot of people is how the transparency of how the Nigerian government would manage these funds being repatriated. We've often talked about monies repatriated in the past. We had over $300 million from the Abacha loot. We've had, so even following that, millions of dollars. But in terms of how it will be used and the actual process or the actual disbursement of the funds is what a lot of Nigerians are looking at. According to the Minister of Justice, Lateef Fagbemi, he says that we deploy through the World Bank for the Rural Electrification Project. That's $50 million of that, and $2 million will be deployed to the International Institute of Justice to expand the justice system and also counter corruption. That's an announcement. There's a big difference between an announcement and actual follow through in terms of using the money and not having the danger of the funds being reluted. So a lot of people, CISLAC has called for that. SERAP has called for transparency in the way that the money is being disbursed so that we don't have a reluting of loots. Then beyond that, I think it also exposes, despite the EFCC's work and efforts, it exposes how porous and, the system, how weak our system is when it comes to people in leadership and how corruption and stealing of funds, let me use the very basic word, stealing of funds for Nigerians. If you look at the time of Diezani Alison Madueke and now, a lot hasn't changed. In fact, unfortunately for us, a lot of the high-profile cases have been helped and found out by international bodies. We wait for the US or the United Kingdom to help us to investigate and repatriate these funds. And what do we do back home? We celebrate those who we know have funds that they cannot obviously account for who were in power. So these are some of the conversations we should have. And I'm hoping that, people have said they've tried to repatriate hard. Many successive governments have tried to. But some Nigerians are saying perhaps the best hope for justice for her would be for her to be tried in the UK, which is an indictment on our justice system and the way that we're able to investigate corruption cases and bring officials, leaders, politicians like her who have been involved in alleged corruption brought to book. I think that's one thing from this story.
Okay, the big story about the Diezani Alison Madueke story is the fact about the illicit transfer of funds, illicit flow of funds, which the United Nations had tried to address through the United Nations Convention on Corruption, and also the Process of Crime Recovery and Management Act. These are the two basic conventions in this regard. And I think that the point that was being made by the Attorney General of the Federation, Mr. Lateef Fagbemi, when he was signing this asset agreement, transfer of funds between the US and Nigeria, is simply this, that one, those protocols, international protocols, will seem to be working in terms of illicit financial flows. In other words, if you steal money from any country, you put it anywhere, it can be traced. Two, the cooperation that exists between Nigeria and the United States in terms of collaboration, cooperation to track, proceeds of illicit transactions. 3, the Proceeds of Crime, Recovery and Management Act that I talked about. That's the enabling framework. And what this incident seems to prove is that it works. However, the management of the recovery is where the rub is. Many Nigerians are saying, yes, the U.S., they've repatriated 52.8, right? $52.8 million of looted funds from Nigeria. What to do with it is what is important for us. And it is as follows. Mr. Lateef Fagbemi says $50 million will be given to the World Bank, which will be used for rural electrification, renewable energy in Nigeria. Nigerians would like to see that, in real fact, that money taken from their common wealth will now be used to serve the owners of the money. The second thing is that Nigeria says the remaining $2.8 million or so, is going to be given to the International Institute of Justice to, provide capacity training for counterterrorism in East, West, and North Africa. That is that about that. But there are other stories which I would like to deal with very quickly. Now, in 2021, in Chad, it was Chad you were talking about, Mahamat Debi seized power after the death of his father, Idris Deby Itno. And now, in 2024, he tried to legitimize himself and won the election, an election that was disputed, that was considered non-credible, by international observers. And now, on December 29, 2024, the same country of Chad organized elections at the municipal and regional levels, boycotted by 10 political parties, including the Transformers Party, led by Success. Success, I think that's his name, Success Sekou or so, And now the results have been released, provisional results saying, 51.6% turnout, which is very low, and that it is the ruling party that has won 188 out of the 234 seats available in the parliament. What it means is that Mahamat Idris Deby, has consolidated his hold on power. In other words, this is about authoritarianism, the rising wave of authoritarianism in West Africa and in Africa generally. But there are bigger challenges in Chad. The Boko Haram threat in the Lake Chad region. The issue also about, this departure from France and this newfound romance with Russia. To go to the United States, very quickly. Gavin Newsom, when the wildfires occurred in Eaton, the Pacific Palisades, and in other places, Lydia and all those places, don't let me bore you with the list of the 8 wildfires. He issued an executive order now to see how resources can be mobilized to fight. But this has turned out to be apocalyptic. It has turned out to be surreal. It has turned out to be chaotic. Now he has issued a second order. What are the details of this second executive order? 1, to deal with the climate equality, CPQA it is called, and also the Coastal Act, which will create problems in terms of rebuilding. 2, to ask the lawyers, to look at the laws and see what they can reduce in terms of building regulations, which will make it easier. In other words, all those frameworks will make it difficult to rebuild. And he says we should rebuild. This should be LA 2.0 under his watch. But there are, of course, other issues about insurance, about the human aspect of the agony that the people of Southern California have suffered. And the real threat that this could continue, and theories being put up, whether it was the energy system that caused the problem, or whether it is climate change that caused the problem. But whatever it is, we identify with the people of Los Angeles and Southern California in general. in the face of the devastation and
Agreed.
life-transforming experience that they've been through.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. Thank you all for your great analysis. Let's move very quickly on to the newspapers this morning. And as ever, we start with the front page of This Day. Now, This Day leads with comments from Archbishop Kaigama, who has urged President Tinubu to match the words he has spoken of in his message of hope with actions. Now, he delivered his message during a special memorial service for the people who lost their lives essentially in that deadly stampede over in Abuja last month. Also, to the top of This Day, we do have the latest ramblings in this back and forth between General Hydrocarbons Limited and First Bank. You do see the headline there discussing essentially GHL denying that there is any type of money owed to First Bank. Over the weekend, First Bank did release a statement essentially breaking down the crux of this issue, which is the unpayment of a $223 million loan that it says GHL has failed to repay. But as we've seen on the front page of This Day at the very top, GHL have denied owing First Bank any money, much less 225, which is what is the figure which is quoted. So a lot of back and forth between both sides there. It's a story that's also been picked up on the front page of The Nation this morning, which if you look to the top of The Nation also touches on this situation between GHL and First Bank. So we'll continue to follow this controversial story no matter where it goes. Now, moving on to the New Telegraph this morning now. It leads today's edition with the mass exodus of private school students leaving the institutions over that 50% tuition fee hike, as parents are understandably opting for cheaper alternatives. Now, if we move on to the Punch this morning, the Punch reports on the serial outages befalling the country as Dangote, the NNPCL and Total are among the 250 manufacturers and schools and other institutions that have abandoned their respective power distribution companies in order to generate their own electricity. Now, findings from different data sources, including the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, showed that firms have generated up to 6,500 megawatts of electricity altogether, which is higher than Nigeria's power generation, which is currently hovering around 4,500 megawatts. So very, very interesting times ahead there. Now, the Vanguard this morning leads with OPEC's quota eluding Nigeria amid rising oil output. Now, vandalism, oil theft, spills, all hampering Nigeria's oil output. And its picture story does have President Bola Ahmed Tinubu arriving in the UAE capital, Abu Dhabi, for Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. Meanwhile, the Daily Sun this morning reports on how debt servicing in Nigeria has eaten nearly 9 trillion naira in 9 months as the deficit worsens. To that effect, the papers quote experts which predict a 3.5% economic growth rate for Nigeria. Now, The Guardian this morning leads with the GDP rebasing. Now, essentially, it's actually quite a very interesting story. I implore you to read it. And it talks about the artificial increasing of the value of the economy and essentially trying to formalize the $146 billion underground activities which take place in Nigeria, which focuses on human trafficking, prostitution, smuggling, and the government itself has often described as these issues as an economic sabotage. So very interesting to see how that's going to be turned into data that can contribute to the GDP. Also on the front page of The Guardian this morning is a US-based diaspora group endorsing Sheyi Tinubu, the son of the Nigerian president, as the next governor of Lagos State. The Daily Trust this morning focuses on insecurity, reporting that 15 people have been killed and 30 more injured by an airstrike in Zamfara State. The incident took the number of Nigerians killed in accidental drone bombings at various communities in the north in the past 11 years to 465 people killed. That's according to the Daily Trust. And staying with security challenges, the Daily Independent says the federal government has insisted that it will not be engaging the services of foreign mercenaries in tackling security constraints in the country, saying such measures would not provide permanent solutions to the problems befalling Nigeria. However, the federal government has welcomed collaboration with China in domestic production of military equipment in order to avoid delays associated with importing such equipment. If we move on to African papers now, Kenya's Daily Nation leads with Public Service Cabinet Secretary Justin Muturi speaking out against the addiction, the abductions and the disappearances being perpetrated by so-called rogue state agents against believed enemies and critics of the government. And also you can see that education is rearing its this unpaid school fees situation. Children are being sent home because their parents haven't paid their school fees. But this is all, again, against the backdrop of 64 billion shillings that should have been paid by the government to these schools, which has not come. Now, staying with education, the United Kingdom Guardian reports on the huge expansion of artificial intelligence in the public sector. Prime Minister Keir Starmer will launch a sweeping plan to increase 20-fold the AI computing power under public control in the next 5 years. Those are your papers from Nigeria to around the world.
Well, thank you very much, Adefemi. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we cannot go deeper into the analysis of the newspapers. But thank you for giving us a run-through of newspaper headlines from across Nigeria and around the world. We'll see you again tomorrow.